Welcome to Shad's Guitar Show. Whether it's the gear or the players who made the gear famous, join me each episode as we discuss all things guitar. Well, hey there everyone, and welcome into another exciting episode of Shad's Guitar Show. I am so glad you're with me, as always, for another episode. On this episode, we are going to be talking about a band that I have gotten really into lately. I've always been a fan, as I think most people have. I mean, they're a huge band, but I've really started digging into their early work in particular. And I'm talking, of course, about, you've already seen the title of the episode, so you know I'm talking about the Eagles. But in particular, kind of the transition between the early self-titled album, Desperado, On the Border, which is where we find Don Felder joining the band, but the early stuff was a lot more country rock, courtesy of a great player named Bernie Leadon, who was a fantastic pedal steel, banjo, and B-bender telly player, which I really, really love the early stuff in particular, but I also love the later stuff that's a lot more rock, where we see a guitar player named Don Felder enter the picture. So I kind of wanted to talk about that transition and just sort of what Don Felder brought to the band. And Don is kind of one of those guys who created a lot of legendary riffs and, you know, the music for a lot of hugely successful songs, but definitely doesn't have the name recognition of a Don Henley or a Glenn Frey or Joe Walsh. So I want to kind of touch on Don Felder and just what he brought to the Eagles and kind of how he changed the sound. So if you were to ask the average rock fan who defined the Eagles sound, most people are going to say Don Henley, Glenn Frey, maybe they'd throw in Joe Walsh if they've done some homework. But Don Felder, well, he's the guy who quietly, almost invisibly, rewired the entire electrical system of arguably one of the greatest bands in American music history. And today, we're giving him his due. Before we talk about Don Felder, we have to understand what the Eagles were before he arrived, because that contrast is everything. So the Eagles formed in 1971 and were originally Linda Ronstadt's backing band. Glenn Frey, Don Henley, Bernie Leadon, and Randy Meisner. If you go back and listen to those early records, the debut album in 72, Desperado in 73, well, what do you hear? Well, country and folk, twang, beautiful sun-baked California country rock. Bernie Leadon was a banjo and pedal steel guy, and also a B-bender telly guy, who had come out of the Flying Burrito Brothers. The vibe was dusty, desert roads, outlaws, and harmonies that felt like they were sung around a campfire. And look, I absolutely love that era of the Eagles. Peaceful, easy feeling, Take It Easy, Desperado, those were stone cold classics. But the Eagles at that point were not a guitar-forward rock band. They were a gorgeous vocal group with folk and country leanings. The instrumental firepower just wasn't quite there yet. But then something changed. In 1974, the Eagles are recording On the Border with producer Bill Szymczak, who, by the way, deserves his own episode on this show someday. And they bring in a session guitarist to beef up the sound of a couple tracks. And that guitarist is Don Felder. Now here's what you need to know about Felder before we go any further. This is not just some rock and roll hotshot who stumbled into the right room at the right time. This guy had chops and history. He grew up in Gainesville, Florida. And this is one of the great It's a Small World moments in rock history. His childhood guitar teacher was Stephen Stills, and he actually gave guitar lessons to none other than Tom Petty. Not to mention, he had actually played in bands back in those early days with none other than Bernie Leadon, who was the current Eagles guitar player. So Don Felder had been woodshedding his entire life. He had jazz theory, classical techniques, blues feel. He was a player's player. And when he walked into the On the Border sessions, the band noticed immediately. Glenn Frey actually called him the day after the first sessions and offered him a spot in the band on the spot. And just like that, the Eagle who changed everything became an Eagle. Okay, so this is the meat of the episode. Let's talk about what Don Felder actually brought to the Eagles in their sonic identity. Before Felder, the Eagles didn't really have a framework for two electric guitars working together as a unit. With Felder alongside Glenn Frey, who was actually a pretty great guitar player, you suddenly had a band that could build guitar arrangements the way a composer writes for an orchestra. Felder handled a lot of the lead and textural work. He was the guy layering parts, thinking about what each guitar player was doing in the stereo field, making sure the guitars told a story together rather than just playing simultaneously. And this is how you get the intricate, interlocking guitar work that defines the mid to late Eagles catalog. It's not one guy shredding, it's two guitarists in conversation. When Felder joined, the Eagles were at a crossroads. Bernie Leadon was the country folk heart of the band, but Felder came from a much more hard rock leaning place. His influences were more Duane Allman than Graham Parsons and more Cream than the Byrds. You can literally hear the band's center of gravity shifting on the Border. The title track has a grit and an electric energy that the earlier records just didn't have. And then by One of These Nights in 1975, you're in a completely different universe. That album is dark, it's heavy, it's blues rock. The title track opens with this menacing, churning guitar line that feels genuinely dangerous. That's Felder's fingerprint all over it. Felder was one of the pioneers in mainstream rock to really think about the guitar the way a film composer might think about a string section. On Hotel California, you can count the guitar overdubs, and it gets almost absurd. We're talking 8, 9, maybe more distinct guitar parts layered on certain sections. Acoustic and electric working together. Harmonics and rhythm. Lead lines woven into the chordal texture. That approach, the idea that the guitar could be a whole world rather than just an instrument that plays chords and solo, that's a Felder innovation in the context of the Eagles. All right, so we have to spend some serious time here because this is the moment that cements Don Felder's legacy. Hotel California in 1977, arguably one of the greatest rock songs ever recorded. And here's what many people may not know. Don Felder wrote the music. He wrote that riff. He wrote the chord progression. He was sitting in his Malibu house with a 4-track recorder, noodling around, and out came the iconic descending guitar figure in B minor that opens the song. Now, we know it in B minor on the recording, but he actually wrote it in the key of E minor, and they had gone into the studio to record the track, and Don Henley, who was singing the song, figured out that that was way too high for him and that they had to transpose it, which is how it ended up in the key of B minor. So when he brought a bunch of songs that he'd been working on to the recording session where everybody was kind of throwing around ideas, he played this particular track, and Don Henley immediately latched onto it and said, "Let's call it Mexican reggae." I love that. And he handed it to Don and Glenn, who wrote the lyrics and the melodies on top of the music. But think about that. The single most recognizable piece of music the Eagles ever made, the thing you can play 3 notes of and that every person in the country or on earth knows exactly what song it is, came from Don Felder's living room. All right, and then let's talk about the outro. One of the best dual guitar solos at the end of Hotel California here. Felder and Joe Walsh trading licks for 2 minutes and 12 seconds. And it's one of the most perfectly constructed pieces of guitar music in the history of recorded sound. Maybe that sounds a bit dramatic, but seriously, I haven't heard much that I think is better. I definitely don't say that lightly. And Felder had the parts worked out almost entirely in advance, sort of like a classical piece, while Walsh's parts were more improvisational, but they dovetailed together like they'd been playing it together for decades. The way those two guitars weave around each other, one ascending as the other descends, the harmonized lines, the call and response, the way it builds and breathes. There's a reason guitar students have been transcribing that solo for 50 years. There's a reason it ends the song rather than a big vocal chorus. The guitars are the conclusion. They're saying everything that the lyrics couldn't. Felder and Walsh. It's like watching two master sword fighters who've choreographed every move but still make it look dangerous. Okay, and you know I can't do an episode without talking about gear, right? So what was Felder actually playing? Well, his main guitar, the guitar that he played on the Hotel California solo and other aspects of the song, I'm sure, was his 1959 Les Paul Standard that he had acquired in Texas out of the back of a pickup truck for $1,200. So if you know anything about vintage guitars, you know that a 59 Les Paul is essentially the holy grail. And of course, we can't think of the song Hotel California, or really Don Felder in general, without talking about the Gibson EDS 1275 double neck that he used to perform that song live. And it was interesting to learn that Don was using primarily vintage blackface deluxe reverbs and also sometimes some 1950s era narrow panel tweed deluxes to get those amazing gain tones that he was using. So obviously just cranking those amps all the way up, which, is a super great characteristic of the deluxe reverb and a tone that many guys have used over the years. As we've talked about in some other episodes, in particular, the Blackface Deluxe Reverb is probably one of the most recorded amps in history. And I should also note that on the intro to Hotel California, Don runs the EDS 1275 into a Leslie cabinet as well to get that Leslie sound. Oh, and I learned something really cool in researching this. And this is a really cool guitar geek detail that I love. For the Hotel California outro solo, Felder reportedly tuned his Les Paul down just slightly and used it specifically for the harmonized lines so that when he and Walsh played together, there was a very subtle pitch shimmer between the two instruments, almost like a chorus effect achieved through tuning rather than electronics. And that little detail is part of what gives the outro its haunting, almost eerie quality. All right, so let's step back for a second and look at the big picture. When Don Felder joined the Eagles, they were a very good country rock band. After Don Felder joined the Eagles, they became one of the biggest rock bands in history. Hotel California is one of the best-selling albums of all time. The Eagles are consistently cited as one of the greatest rock bands ever recorded. And that pivot point, the moment where they went from being beloved to legendary, is the arrival of Don Felder and the guitar-forward, rock-oriented sound he helped create. I think what's interesting is that Felder made the Eagles a better version of what they already were. He didn't change the band's identity. The harmonies were still there. The California imagery was still there. The storytelling was still there. But he took all of that and put it in a harder, more complex, more musically sophisticated framework. He gave the Eagles teeth. And the irony is that Felder spent decades being the least credited member of one of the most credited bands in rock history. His relationship with Henley and Fry deteriorated badly over the years, ultimately leading to his firing from the band in 2001. He wrote a tell-all memoir called Heaven and Hell, My Time with the Eagles, which I just finished listening to, actually, and it's great. I highly recommend it. There were lawsuits, there were countersuits, and it got really ugly. But none of that changes what's on tape. None of that changes what you hear when you drop the needle on Hotel California. Don Felder changed the Eagles. Don Felder made those records sound the way they sound. And any honest accounting of classic rock history has to put him where he belongs, at the center of one of the greatest guitar legacies in American music. And while ultimately Don Henley, primarily number one, Glenn Frey, number two, would get credit as the principal songwriters in the Eagles. And, obviously they wrote the lyrics, they wrote the melodies, and kind of that's what people gravitate to and listen to. The guitar work, the music, all the solos, all the hooks, all of that stuff is courtesy mostly of Don Felder. And I don't think the songs would be nearly as good without Don's contributions. Don has gone on to do some fairly successful solo albums, but nothing that compares to the legacy that he created with the Eagles. And after listening to this episode, I encourage you to go back and listen to especially the album Hotel California with fresh ears and pick out all those incredible lead lines, all those harmonies, all the things that Don created within the framework of the Eagles that are almost songs within the song. And I think you'll be amazed at just how much is really in there when you start listening for it. All right, so that's a wrap on this episode of Don Felder and his contribution to the Eagles and just how their sound changed. I hope you learned something, and I hope you will go back and revisit those albums. They are really, really spectacular. And if you enjoyed the episode, I hope that you will share it with a friend. Also, wherever you're listening right now, take a minute to leave a 5-star review. That is so incredibly helpful. I've also got a link to my Venmo if you want to contribute a few bucks to help keep the show going, or leave a comment and just tell me that you're enjoying the show. When you get over to YouTube, make sure you're following the show, Shad's Guitar Show, subscribe there, and follow the show on Instagram as well. And remember, if you'll keep listening, I'll keep talking about all things guitar.